Hello and welcome to my podcast called Innervation. Innervation was inspired by my previous podcast, Silence, where over the course of 2 years, I spoke every week with a woman from science, technology, engineering and mathematics, or STEM. In total, I spoke with 100 women in the end, and I kept all of those guests anonymous so that they could talk openly and honestly about their lives. We discussed their experiences, what they've learned along their life journeys, and their hopes and ideas for living fulfilling and contented lives. Because their identities were always kept so safe, the conversations on Silence were always so raw and transparent, and we didn't just talk about being women in STEM, but about everything. The topics that tended to come up are the same topics that I tend to discuss with my friends and family, and people come up to me after a talk and ask me about, in private. So I thought, rather than leave these topics within closed circles, how about putting them out into the world and letting everyone think about them and discuss them? So what I've done is I've sifted through all the episodes of Silence to bring you my favourite sound bites about these certain topics. And each week on Innervation, I'll be reflecting on the perspectives that came up on Silence that I actually feel are pearls of wisdom that I found particularly provoking, inspiring and empowering, in the hope that they resonate with you too. This week is all about vulnerability. So vulnerability was a topic that was made really popular by one of my absolute role models and sources of inspiration, Brené Brown. And she made vulnerability a topic that we could all talk about by doing her TEDx talk in Houston. And she talked about the power of vulnerability. And I've actually sort of held off having a topic like vulnerability on my show because, I didn't want to sort of look like I was copying her because she does it so well, and she really does document and speak about vulnerability with so much expertise. But then I thought, actually, vulnerability is really something that I struggle so massively with. I mean, I just don't like being vulnerable, and I certainly don't want to ever show people I'm vulnerable. And often, as a result of trying to cover up my vulnerability, I end up acting like a bit of a freak. I may end up getting angry instead of being vulnerable. I may be quite sort of spiky and unkind and defensive and argumentative, just so that I don't have to show my vulnerability. And, that happens when I'm feeling a little bit worried about something or anxious or a little bit kind of unsettled. And, that happens from time to time. Life always throws you challenges and, it's full of twists and turns. And so vulnerability and feeling vulnerable does come up quite a bit in my own life. And I thought, rather than rely on someone like Brené Brown to bring up the topic and share her expertise, I just thought, I'd like to talk about it as just something that happens all the time. I don't think, we ever get to a point where we stop being vulnerable and that's the end of the story. I think, dealing with our vulnerability is a daily bit of effort. And I definitely wanted to bring it to the forefront and kind of make it more of an everyday topic because, for me, it is every day. I feel vulnerable pretty much on a daily basis where I just think, I'm not quite sure if I did that or I did that well, or I'm not really sure about X, Y, and Z in my future, or, even just sort of admitting that you love someone or you really like someone, or that you really rate someone can often be a very vulnerable task. So yeah, it's earned its right on this podcast. And I think in terms of the vulnerability that came up on Silence, vulnerability was something that every woman on my podcast recognised. as an experience. They all acknowledge that from time to time they have felt vulnerable, because some people might not even think they're feeling vulnerable. Some people might be in denial, thinking they're really strong, they've got this, they're full of courage, they are making loads of money, therefore they're never vulnerable, or, they're super fit and athletic, therefore they're never feeling vulnerable, or they're male and not feeling vulnerable. Whatever the reasons may be, there are some people that don't realise that actually there are times when they are feeling vulnerable. So it was nice to be able to acknowledge that women on Silence recognised when they were feeling vulnerable. And so I've pulled together a collection of sound bites from various different episodes where they talk about their vulnerability, and there was a range of perspectives on that. And we'll start off with the quotes where guests didn't really want to show their vulnerability, and they kind of explained why. So first off, this from episode 55.
I'm more willing to show vulnerability, which is not such an easy thing because I think society conditioned us to hide our true feelings. But then, and it's not always easy. And I think I definitely came through a long learning process to be who I am today. And I'm not perfect. I think there are some aspects of my life that I need to work on. The topic that we are talking about today happens to be one aspect of my life that I feel, particularly comfortable and in my shoe with. So, but I think that's, life is so complicated. I mean, it's not complicated in the complicated sense, but in the sense that there's so many different aspects to life. So yeah.
Yeah, I think life really can be a minefield. I feel challenged every single day. I don't know about you, but every single day there's something to work on. Trying to be more professional, trying to be a person of integrity, trying to be kind, trying to not react and maybe respond, trying to be patient, trying to be tolerant, trying to be positive. All these things are challenges every day, and that's not even covering topics where you're actually faced with like a real life challenge. Someone you love gets sick, or you lose a job, or whatever it might be. So it's all of those things make us vulnerable, and I think it can be very multi-layered. I think sometimes we can feel more vulnerable than other times, because I think vulnerability correlates, this is definitely the case with me, vulnerability correlates to other things in my life being stable. So for example, if I know that the weather is going to be really sunny, and then I walk outside without a jacket, and for a moment it just gets a little bit chilly because the sun's gone behind a cloud or something, I don't feel vulnerable. Whereas, if I'm not really sure how the weather's going to be and then I walk outside without a coat, I feel very vulnerable, So sometimes when we have knowledge and security in one aspect of our life, it can make us feel less vulnerable. And so often it can be this juggling act of trying to secure things, different aspects in our life, so that we don't feel vulnerable. If you catch my drift. And so I think what I'm just trying to say is that often we try to reduce our sense of feeling vulnerable by making other aspects of our life more secure. And I think that's what my guest from episode 55 is alluding to, because she talks about how we've been conditioned in society to not feel or show our vulnerability. And societal conditioning involves trying to secure a job, trying to secure education, trying to secure a relationship, trying to just find security in everything. And it's all, I think, sort of aimed at just not feeling vulnerable. As though vulnerability is something to be feared. And my guest from episode 25 talks about just outing herself with her vulnerability and that being a real tool to empowerment, just admitting that you feel vulnerable. But not everybody gets that. Not everyone is strong and courageous enough to admit when they are feeling vulnerable. Vulnerability is still seen as a very taboo subject, not something you would admit to. This from episode 25.
I wrote an article once about the problems of having a family and combining it with career and all the rest of it. And it was in quite a well-known journal. And somebody said to me, well, that's the end of your career now, it's like finished, it's over. And I said, really? Because nobody likes to show that vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to perhaps not be afraid of showing vulnerability, in the right circumstances. Because actually we do need support and help, that's difficult, I think. So it is being slightly not assertive. It's more being brave and saying, okay, at the moment I need help. Who can help me?
I agree with this guest. I think admitting that we need help is part of showing our vulnerability, and there's no problem in showing that we need help. But I think also it's admitting that we are just human. And, the perfectionist in me is absolutely screaming at the idea of admitting we're just human, because I set such high standards for myself and can never ever achieve them. And part of maturing for me has been to admit that maybe I don't do things perfectly. Well, not maybe, I definitely don't do things perfectly. But that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail. It's okay to learn from all these mistakes. In fact, it's great. But all of that failure does make me feel extremely vulnerable. And, a guest like my guest from episode 25 admits that showing that vulnerability is empowering. It's not the norm, that kind of perspective. A lot of people think that by saying, I failed, I made a mistake, I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm feeling insecure, it's like ooh, gosh, it's over. And I think both perspectives still exist, which is quite frightening, because it's been many years since that Brené Brown talk, and I think we are edging towards that mentality of being a bit more relaxed about making mistakes, especially after this pandemic. I feel like everyone has just become a bit more human in their approach. But yeah, I think there is still those two extreme schools of thought where people just want to put on a brave face all the time and look like they've got this. And it actually puts a lot of pressure on the people that do have the strength to show their vulnerability, because there's always that awkward gap after showing your vulnerability that maybe you shouldn't have done that. But I still think, if you do show your vulnerability and it's not well received, it's still really strong and resilient to have been able to be vulnerable in the first place. So my guest from episode 25 goes on to say more about showing one's vulnerability, and I think this is the way mentalities are trending. I think, it's definitely, we're moving into an era we are in an era where people are becoming more and more brave to just speak their truth. This from episode 25.
And there was, it was very brave, because younger PhD students and people were talking about their vulnerability in public, perhaps for the first time, and how they had dealt with mental health issues or other things, disabilities or their sexual orientation. It was very, very brave of them to do that, I think, because people tend to keep these things covered over, and people tend to try and cope with them all. And this can cause more problems, because this can make you feel isolated or, vulnerable. And I think it's that sense of actually realizing that we are all human, and that we do our work, we do our science, that's fantastic, but actually we're all human. So there are certain vulnerabilities as well, and we have to deal with those.
Absolutely, we are all human, and being vulnerable can be so beautiful. I think what can be extremely intimidating is putting on a brave face, and I've definitely been guilty of that, especially in my engineering days when I was surrounded by so many men and I wanted to kind of be like them and sort of like, come across as being as strong, as knowledgeable, as badass, as, rough and tumble as the guys that I was surrounded by. And what that actually looked like was just a young woman being really mean and really intimidating. Like, it wasn't endearing at all, and it wasn't relatable, and it wasn't accessible. I mean, I was just, behind a facade and a boundary, and I kept people at a distance because I didn't want them to see my vulnerability. And so I think putting on that, it's not necessarily a brave face, because I think bravery involves courage and something more humble than putting up a facade. I think when we put on a mask, let's say, to hide our vulnerability, I think that creates a lot of distance and a disconnection with others. And I think vulnerability creates a connection with other people. And I think we're all looking for connection, right? We're all just wanting to belong to a community and be part of something. And so being vulnerable allows for that. And so, as always, with the topics on innovation, it's always about turning inwards. And I think part of allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of other people is actually figuring out what makes you tick, figuring out the parts of you that are fragile, understanding yourself more and really turning inwards and getting to know yourselves. Because I think when we know our strengths as well as our weaknesses, it means that we have a really good self-awareness of our vulnerabilities, which can only make us stronger. I mean, if you've got a wound on your right arm and it's deep and it's painful, you're not going to put your right arm up to defend yourself. You're going to end up trying to hide it and trying to protect it and trying to keep it undercover just so you don't get hurt more. And I think the same applies to an emotional landscape where, by knowing exactly where you are vulnerable, you can help to protect yourself. But, that means being self-loving and self-compassionate and self-protective, whilst also connecting with other people and showing them the sides of you that aren't wounded, but in a sort of very transparent and open way, not in a sort of fake facaded way, if that's a word, facaded. And so I think my guest in episode 59 touches on that sentiment. So let's take a listen.
There's something about vulnerability in there, which is a really awkward thing for people to want to discuss. And it's, I think you have to sort of start understanding your vulnerabilities to understand the things that you need to strengthen you. Does that make sense?
Right.
So if you feel that you need to think about your sense of self, what is it about yourself that it unsettles you, and so you have to sort of go to that place in yourself and think about the stuff that none of us want to think about, which is the things that we don't think we're particularly proud of or we don't do particularly well, and just sort of own them a little bit, and think,
let me, like, if it was a scientific experiment, you'd look through the methodology of your experiment and say, yeah, we really could do better in this area, of measurement, or we could do better in the way in which we're analysing, or you'd lay it all out and say, right, if we're going to do this experiment again, this is where we can strengthen our methodology, right? It's almost like you need to do that. You need to be brave enough to just lay it out and just admit that, there are some areas where, you could do with a little bit more work on yourself.
I always love guests that make it about science, relating that very soulful, spiritual side of them with their scientific brains. And it's so true. I mean, when we are running experiments, finding out the weaknesses and the strengths of it and the failures and the triumphs are part of doing better work, better research, getting better results. It's not about hiding the negativity. It's about bringing it to light and saying, okay, this is a shortcoming. How can we make it better? And, not punishing oneself for being vulnerable. I think I was certainly raised in a kind of era where being vulnerable was seen as being weak, and it so isn't today. I mean, I can't see vulnerability as weakness, especially when I see it in my friends. When I see people being vulnerable, I just want to connect with them. I just want to put my arms around them and be like, it's going to be okay, but when it comes to me being vulnerable, yeah, it's a bit harder, I can see just how empowering it is with my friends, but when it comes to me actually doing it, not so easy. But it is all about learning about oneself and getting to know all aspects of yourself and others. And I just think, taking an interest in one's own behaviour and growth and evolution is just so character strengthening. And, from that, I think the less vulnerable you become. So in plucking up the courage to be vulnerable, I think you end up developing more courage and more strength. And so the irony is that in the pursuit of being more transparent about the person that you are and allowing your vulnerabilities to be seen, you end up becoming even more empowered. And that's the kind of counterintuitive way that being open and honest about yourself works. So I'm going to leave you with this last quote from episode 14, which I think sums up the beauty of allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
And I've realised that actually what I've learned really is that the more I have been myself and the more I have drawn upon my personal experiences, the better my work has become, the more work I have won, and the bigger impact I make on my clients, because I draw from those experiences I have and try and bring them into their businesses. So it's left me vulnerable, but I don't feel afraid of that anymore.
Being vulnerable isn't something to be feared. It's something to be embraced and something to be celebrated, because I think in being vulnerable, you end up connecting with others and others are able to connect with you. So it's not about putting on this show that you've got this and that you can handle everything and that you're on top of things. I think it's actually just having the strength to say, you know what, not doing too good with this, because in admitting that, you're able to do something about it for yourself. Thank you so much for listening this week. Please do subscribe to this podcast and maybe even rate and review it if you can. I'd love to have your feedback about this episode or any others that you've listened to, and maybe some suggestions for future topics for this show. It's all about self-discovery and evolution on Innervation, so be kind and loving to yourselves, and I wish you all a great week.